Emily Nixon from University of Liverpool.
Great, thank you. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about how behaviour could shape behaviour data and some work that I did back during COVID that was related to this. But first of all, just to give a bit of a background about myself for those who haven't met me yet, I'm an infectious disease modeller, but I have an interdisciplinary background. And so I started out in kind of biological sciences and then moved towards becoming more mathematical over time. And my research area is kind of using mathematical modelling to understand infectious disease dynamics and support outbreak response. And behaviour is really important, and trying to incorporate behaviour kind of across all of this. And I work kind of in quite a few different settings, but similar questions around behaviour come up. So kind of in livestock settings, questions around farmer behaviour and the treatment choices that they might make are kind of similar in kind of the different behaviours you're thinking about when you're thinking about human disease. Obviously, there are some differences, or kind of with wildlife and how disease can spill over from wildlife to humans. Again, there's behavioural elements there. But today I'm going to be focusing and talking specifically about social contact data, which is a method that we often use to incorporate human behaviour into epidemiological models. So this data is often collected via surveys, and it's really important for understanding transmission of airborne and close contact infectious diseases. So kind of prior to this being an area of research, the data on sexual contacts had been collected, but it was thought that social contacts and kind of how that relates to transmission of respiratory viruses would be harder to quantify. So but this kind of from 1997 onwards has started to be a field that's used. And I think we had another talk that was saying before how it's really important to have consistency across surveys, because how people interpret different questions might be not what you expect. So generally, the kind of questions about the contacts are often kept quite almost exactly the same or similar, and we try to define contacts in the same way as other social contact surveys do, in the hope that people are kind of as consistent in how people are interpreting that. So it's often just defined as a two-way conversation, and this was further refined to say that it should require at least 3 words and not involve a raised voice and be within 2 meters. There's sometimes other definitions as well, and often you're asked about kind of whether there was any physical contact involved as well, and how long this interaction happened for. So some of the main social contact surveys, and you may have heard of some of these. So Polymod was one of the first large-scale ones that happened across 8 different European countries. And then during COVID-19, Comix was another one in Europe that captured changes in behaviour during the pandemic. And then Reconnect is one that kind of post-pandemic social contact patterns have been collected. So I was involved in running a social contact survey during COVID-19, but this was specifically in a university setting, and kind of asking students and university staff about their social contacts, because we were also modelling kind of specifically in the setting, so we could advise policymakers and universities about different interventions they could put in place to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. And a university setting is quite unique because people have very different social contacts to in normal other environments. Students have kind of big lectures where they come into contact with lots of people in a room, and they have lots of other kind of social activities. And so that's why we wanted to do the social contact survey. So this is just showing an example of the kind of data that social contact surveys, including ours, collect. So we asked about groups and people. So if there were, because people have to enter information about each contact they have, and so if you're in a lecture theatre, you're not going to be able to enter information about every single other person that was in the lecture theatre with you. So that's why we kind of had this question about groups, which is also done in other social contact surveys as well. And then also we asked about individual people as well that people could meet. So we asked about the age of the person they met, whether they were part of the household, whether touch was involved, where they spoke to them, if it was inside or outside, and how long it was for. So this again is reflected with a lot of other social contact surveys. And once we have this data, then they're used in modelling, often kind of via using contact and connectivity matrices. So Lee et al., quite a few people involved are in this room, wrote a good review of these kind of matrices recently. And then we can use these in structured compartmental models. So they often are structured by age. So here we have kind of the age of participant along the x-axis and the age of the contact along the y-axis. But models could be structured in a different way. So for example, in the university setting, we were structured by what course people were on or what accommodation they were in. And we can use this data to help us estimate changes in the effective reproduction number and also to quantify behavioural changes and assess the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions on disease transmission. So there's been biases associated with social contact surveys. So just generally, so women are more likely to participate, although actually where studies that kind of require continued participation, it has been found that the reverse is seen. But then on the other hand, lower participation has been associated with lower educational status, smoking, young age, lower vaccine rates and living with children. And online recruitment is kind of hopefully can help lower long-term participation rates. And then there's certain contacts that are also less likely to be captured in social contact surveys, so short duration or weekend contacts, often people don't have them. And then there's also the issue of recall bias. So we often ask about yesterday in the hope that people are more likely to remember that. But if you think back and you remember everybody that you met yesterday, probably not. Yeah, that there is the kind of bias of being able to remember that. So yeah, social contact surveys are used to capture behavioural changes, but then behaviour also influences what enters these data sets. So you have your kind of true behaviour, and then we're capturing some aspect of that, but behaviour is influencing what we're observing. And then we have our estimated contact matrix. But actually, in a study that I'm going to be talking about today, we also found that not only does behaviour kind of influence what we have in our data sets, but this behaviour was often responsive to epidemiological conditions themselves. So, you know, we models often do, we are trying to think about and talk about how we can include dynamic behaviour in models, but also it seemed that the data that we were getting about behaviour is some way coupled or related to the epidemiological dynamics as well that we're seeing. So this is work that I'll be talking about is from a study where I worked with qualitative scientists. So I'm not a qualitative scientist, but we worked together and had a mixed methods analysis of participation in the social contact survey that I was running. So we had focus groups where participants were kind of asked about questions around kind of why they would participate or not participate. So I'll just go through some of the main results from that, particularly ones that relate to kind of this relationship that seems to be seen with the epidemiological conditions. So we saw that rising cases of COVID-19 in the student community then reinforced the need of them to want to help end the lockdowns, which was a motivator for why some of them were taking part. So you can see some quotes here from some of the participants. So from a lot of these quotes, you can see, you know, these rising cases, it was making them feel like they could help in some way. And it, you know, it was something that was in the forefront of their mind. It felt important. And so they wanted to be able to help, and that was motivating them to take part in the survey. But then when restrictions eased, then this appeared to reduce the importance of COVID-19 research. And so people were not kind of thinking about it as much and felt like it maybe wasn't as important anymore. And we, this graph kind of shows along the bottom, it's showing the different events that were happening in the university, so and across the country. And I'm sorry, you probably can't read all of this now, but you can look up the figure on the paper later if you're interested. So we have kind of things like national lockdowns or welcome week at university, and then we also have the vaccination rate is the blue line in the student population, and then the number of cases, and then at the top is our participation in the survey. So the yellow is people who participated and the grey is people who didn't continue to participate because it was a longitudinal survey, so it was something that was sent out every week. So that's what we're calling the non-responders there. And we found that completion rates and people kind of continuing to respond dropped substantially when lockdown measures were eased and vaccination uptake was increased. And also you can see kind of the peak here where we had the most participants was also corresponded with an outbreak in the university and in the country, and then later on there's a much smaller peak. So we had recruitment campaigns at this peak and at the smaller peak in participation, but because of the outbreak happening at the university at the time, we feel like that was probably why we had about 5 times more in the participants, and maybe also because it was a more novel thing, and then at that point maybe people had more fatigue from it. So, but another additional point is that with the movement and contact restrictions, participants often had fewer contacts to report. So it made it quicker and easy to complete. But then as the social measures were eased, they had more contact with others, and that meant it took them longer to complete the survey because they had more things to fill out. And they also, it was easier for them to complete the survey because they had more time spent online in lockdowns, but as it was eased, then the opportunities to complete the survey were reduced. So kind of to summarize the kind of main points from that, it seemed that changes in epidemiology could directly influence how many people are participating in this research where we're trying to collect this behavioural data. It's also maybe influencing the demographic characteristics of people who make up the sample pool and also the quality of data. So kind of the question that I have around this is, if these participation and reporting behaviours change with epidemiological conditions, how should this be reflected in the collection, interpretation and use of behavioural data for epidemiological inference and modelling? And I was also thinking about, whether we want to include this in some way in models, but I think probably first we need to think about how this could be adjusted for before we start to also add another aspect into models. So I think, am I over? I've got 2 minutes left. Okay, great. So the first kind of effect that we were seeing is whether epidemiological conditions were affecting how many people participate. And again, this is just results from this work that we did, and we haven't definitely quantified a meaningful effect, but there is other indirect evidence as well. And this, if this is true, if the epidemiology is affecting how many people participate, that is important, because Ellen Brooks Pollock and Leon Dannon have done work about how sample size is actually important in social contact surveys. So some potential solutions could just be to use incentives or ensure a good experience so that people just continue to participate, or to replenish your participants, or kind of retrospectively to use some inference-driven approaches alongside alternative data if you have it. Also, this effect of maybe the demographic characteristics of respondents being coupled to the epidemiology does seem to be the case in other studies, and potential solutions could be around the data collection, or as well having some kind of post hoc adjustments. And then finally, with the data quality, there's sort of different things to think about here. So whether the quality of that people are reporting their social contacts varies with the perceived risk, or whether it just decreases over time, are kind of slightly separate things. Another study has looked quite a lot at the fatigue of people replying over time and not producing as accurate results over time. And also the epidemiology was decreasing over the time, but whether we can see this kind of variation with the perceived risk, it's not sure yet. But Chosin et al. Did do some work looking at adjustments for survey fatigue in social contact surveys. So yeah, I just have my question again here that I brought earlier about, whether if this does happen, if we do have these behaviours changing with epidemiological conditions affecting the behaviour data that we have, how should this be reflected in how we collect the data, interpret the data and use it? And does this also go beyond social contact surveys? Is behaviour affecting the other behaviour data we're collecting in other contexts as well? Thank you.